Have you ever wondered what makes a good listener, but why it's hard for most of us to actually listen well to others? Today we'll find out. I'm Dr. Rich Hansen, founder of the Leadership Coaching Network, where our mission is empowering African leaders as agents of transformation for people, organizations, and society. In today's presentation from our Coaching for Transformation course, we look carefully at what it means to really listen to someone and how just the very gift of listening can unlock all kinds of creative things in someone else. We'll also look at why it's hard for us to listen and how we can overcome those obstacles. Let's talk about listening. The basics of listening that makes a difference. Here are two quick quotes about listening. Most people do not listen with the intent to understand. They listen with the intent to reply. I've been guilty of that so many times in my life, and I'm guessing you may as well. I'm listening to someone not to really understand them, but rather just to pick up a clue, so as soon as they finish talking, I jump right in with what I want to say about that topic. So if they're talking about their favorite football team, I'm not really listening to understand what they're saying or appreciate what they might be feeling. I'm just listening, so as soon as they stop, I can jump right in and talk about my football team. The other one is this: good coaching is not the art of giving good advice, but the art of asking good questions. We're going to be hearing a lot today about advice, and there's nothing wrong with giving people advice, particularly if maybe they ask for it. But often what gets in the way of really listening to someone is our desire, our attitude to give them advice. We might think we're doing them a big favor by giving them our advice, but coaching is not about giving advice. And so in this course, we're talking about coaching. We're learning coaching skills. We're wanting to be transformed from the inside out, as we talked about last week. And so we want to learn alternatives, a different way of having a conversation that does not end in giving advice, but in rather ends in asking good questions. How do we become a good listener that we want to be? I'm making the assumption every single one of you here, and those who might be missing today and watching this recording, you want to be a good listener. Otherwise, you wouldn't be investing the time and effort in this course. Well, one place to start is with Christian scripture from the book of James, where it says, "My brothers, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. If anyone considers himself religious and yet does not keep a tight rein on his tongue, he deceives himself, and his religion is worthless." And so here the scripture is saying to us, we need to be quick to listen and slow to speak. I think sometimes, unfortunately, we are doing just the opposite. We are quick to speak and slow to listen. But here is certainly, for those of us who are Christians, an endorsement that listening is important, and keeping a rein on our tongue. You know, a rein is what you pull back on a horse to stop it. Keeping a rein on our tongue is very important. Otherwise, we can even deceive ourselves. So let me give you a couple of testimonies to the power of listening. One comes from Martha. She was back in our cohort 5 advanced course. And she told us this story actually during the cohort meeting, just like we're having right now. And it was so powerful for all of us who listened that I asked her if she might be willing to share it. And so she wrote it down, and let me just read it to you. I recently lost my mom, and from that painful experience, I learned the following about listening as one of the coaching skills. I was with my mom the week she was sick. I was so engaged in giving her advice about this and that, I never listened or sought to understand. It has been 18 days now since she passed, and I realized what hurts the most, or at least me, in losing a loved one, is never listening, always doing or giving advice. I felt the greatest gift I could have given my mom was to listen, intentionally listen, wholeheartedly listen, which I didn't. I lost my chance with her, but with the rest of my loved ones, I will listen, listen, listen. My one comfort is she is with the Lord. I don't know about you, but every time I hear this, even though I've heard it many times now, my mind goes back to when I was listening to her tell us this, and the passion she felt about missing the opportunity in her mom's last days to actually just listen, which is what her mom needed, rather than giving advice and trying to always do things for her, and how painful that realization became. And so here's one person, I think speaking for many, that realized, in this case, she realized it a little bit too late, that the best thing, as she says this herself, the greatest gift she could have given to her mom was to intentionally listen, to wholeheartedly listen. Genuine, good, deep listening, friends, is indeed, exactly as Martha says, one of the greatest gifts we can give people. It's a precious gift because most people receive it so seldom. There's so few times most people really genuinely, deeply feel listened to. And when we can offer that to someone, where we don't have our own agenda, we're not giving them advice, we're not just, as soon as they stop talking, we jump in with whatever we want to tell them, but we have all the focus on them and we wholeheartedly, as Martha says, listen. That's a great gift. Here's one other one that I want to share, and it's from this little book called Life Together. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a very famous German theologian during World War II. And during World War II, he actually created an underground seminary because the Nazi regime, Adolf Hitler, you know the history, was against the Christian church. And so they had a secret seminary, a secret training center for pastors. And he wrote this book, Life Together, about life in that seminary, that secret seminary community. And here's what he says about listening. I'm going to read you just a couple of paragraphs from this book. Just as love to God begins with listening to his word, so the beginning of love for the brethren, okay, people around us, is learning to listen to them. Christians, especially ministers, okay, so now he's speaking to me and anyone else here who might be a minister, a pastor. Listen to this. Christians, especially pastors, so often think they must always contribute something when they are in the company of others, that this is the one service they have to render. They forget that listening can be a greater service than speaking. So I'll ask myself, since I've been a pastor for over 40 years, and I'll ask you to think about any pastor you might know. Do any of us know pastors who believe that listening is a greater service than speaking? He goes on to say, many people are looking for an ear that will listen. They do not find it among Christians because these Christians are telling when they should be listening. But he who can no longer listen to his brother will soon no longer be listening to God either. He will be doing nothing but prattle in the presence of God too. Listen to these last two lines. This is the beginning of the death of the spiritual life. And in the end, there is nothing left but spiritual chatter. One who cannot listen long and patiently will presently be talking beside the point and be never really speaking to others. Anyone who thinks that his time is too valuable to spend keeping quiet will eventually have no time for God or his brother, but only for himself and his own follies. I don't know about you, but that really hits home to me. That if I'm not willing to listen carefully to my brother or my sister, eventually I will lose the habit of listening altogether, including listening to God. I think that's a danger. You're welcome to agree or disagree with that. How can we move away from giving advice? Because I believe that, as you heard Sigureda say, and I've heard many, many times over these 17 cohorts, Ethiopia is an advice-giving culture. It's a culture where people like to kind of tell things and give advice. So here's a book you might be interested in. It's called The Advice Trap. And in this book, the author talks about this advice monster that lives inside of each of us. And he gives 4 reasons why giving advice can be a barrier to genuinely effective listening. As Martha said, as Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, and then as Sigureda said. So here are the 4 reasons. First, you may be working on the wrong problem. So you're listening to someone and you want to give them an advice, but you listen only long enough that your mind goes, aha, this is the advice they need. And so then you jump in and give that advice. The first danger is you haven't listened long enough to understand what their real problem is. And so their real problem may be here, but you've only listened a little bit and you've jumped to your advice. And so your advice just totally misses them because you haven't listened long enough or well enough to understand what the real problem is. Number 2, our advice is not as good as we think it is. Now that takes a little humility, doesn't it? It might seem like, well, you know, I'm experienced. I've been a pastor 42 years. I have a lot of good advice. But the problem is that our good advice comes only from our context. And so where does my advice come from? It comes from my life experience. It comes from the experiences I've had with my personality, in my culture, in my personal background. And so let's just take marriage as an example. So when I've been a pastor for 42 years, I had many, many people come to me about marriage counseling. And I tried to listen to them and not give advice because I realized that the context of their marriage might be totally different than mine. And just because a certain thing worked for me in my marriage with the personality of me and my wife and our context and our culture and so forth, had no guarantee it was going to work in another marriage. And that's the second thing. Our advice is only as good as our own experience, but we might be talking to someone with totally different context than us, where our advice could even be harmful rather than helpful. Number three is, as it says, instead of helping, it harms people. Maybe because it's just not good advice, but maybe because it also disempowers them. It controls them. So the next time they have a problem, they have to come back for more advice, and they keep coming back and coming back because they have not learned how to settle that problem or address that problem for themselves. This is the old story about, do you want to give a person a fish or teach them to fish? If you keep giving them advice, that's like giving them the fish. The next time they're hungry, they have to come back for another fish. Whereas if you teach them to fish, which is what coaching tries to do, then eventually the next time they have an issue, they can settle it themselves because their capacity has increased and they're able to figure things out, find their own solution. And then the fourth one is what Dietrich Bonhoeffer said. Giving advice can actually risk harming us, the advice giver, because we can be so focused on speaking rather than listening and talking rather than focusing on the other, that eventually it can cause us spiritual harm ourselves. You know, we use God just as a way to get what we want. We lose the ability to actually listen to God. Let's remind us of something that we talked about last time. So we're still talking about listening, obviously, but here's a situation that I'm sure all of us have been in many, many times in our lives. So here's a person who's saying, here's the problem I'm having with my teenager. Okay, so I'm just using that as an example, but it could be anything that they say they're having a problem about or an issue about, but it's something that we also have had a little experience in. So the person says, teenager problems. Aha, I know about that. I will focus on my content and tell you all about my teenager problems as a parent. Or I will give you advice because I am also a parent of a teenager. And so we tell our content and we give advice. That's the most natural thing in the world. Remember, we said at the very beginning, many of us listen not seeking to understand, but with wanting to reply. Our listening is not with the intent or the goal of understanding. Our listening is with the goal of replying. This is a picture of that. Someone says teenager problems. We have also had a teenager problem because we're the parent of a teenager. And so we could focus on our content, and based on our content, we give advice. But that's not what we're doing in coaching. Last time we talked about this whole difference between content and process. And maybe that seemed very kind of abstract to you last time we met in session one, but hopefully now you see how very down to earth, how realistic